Does higher FPS really make you do more damage? Are Arc Souls worth it for raid DPS? Over the course of making my 7-part DPS series and creating my boss damage spreadsheet, I've encountered a lot of frequently asked questions about abilities, perks, weapons, and swapping. Thankfully, with the amount of testing I've done in the past 2 months, I'm lucky enough to have access to the resources required to answer all of these questions. While I've compiled the content of my answers in the FAQ tab in my spreadsheet, I still get these questions quite often, so I thought I'd answer all of them in video form. Since the goal of this format is accessibility, I've split all 25 or so questions into 3 separate videos since I don't want to make another hour-long monster. On the other hand, I don't want to end up making 25 5-minute videos either, even though some of these topics could very well flesh out a video on their own. Speaking of which, since this video's focus is abilities, let's start with a question recently posed and investigated by several other content creators. Does your FPS affect certain damage options? The short answer is no. While plenty of videos have made claims that weapons and abilities like Leviathan's Breath and Storm Grenades do tick damage that scales with FPS, from the boss health bar testing that I have done, this is simply not true. As for Leviathan's Breath, I was unable to reproduce the extra chunking on 2 different PCs at around 180 FPS, and health bar damage remained relatively consistent through all tests down to 30 FPS. I also tried other weapons including Wither Horde, Anarchy, and Pack Hunter rockets, none of which had any noteworthy changes in health bar damage at FPS values ranging from 30 to uncapped. Touch of Thunder Storm Grenades were also a test subject and yielded similar results. One can only assume that the various wipe screen values reported by the game in other testing may have come as a result of the game calculating wipe screen damage totals on a per frame basis, whereas actual damage calculations are done at a higher rate. From my experience, wipe screen numbers are literally a running total of the numbers displayed on screen while you're doing damage, which are absolutely not the same as the true damage being done to the boss, as we all know by now. How do I properly use Ballidorse Wrathweavers? As many of you know, Ballidorse Wrathweavers provide a 15% boost to stasis weapon damage for 15 seconds to allies near a warlock casting a Winter's Wrath shockwave, represented by the Stasis Shard Overshield buff. While many people assume that this buff renders one player effectively useless, stuck in a mediocre super DPS-wise while providing a middling 15% buff to only one damage type, this is not the case. First, it is possible to self-apply this stasis buff by casting your shockwave as your super ends. Even better, you can cast your shockwave and then swap subclass, instantly ending your super and allowing the use of your weapons once more while preserving the 15% buff to your teammates. Since it's a bit of a pain to wait out your whole super to self-proc as damage starts, it's best to be on Galahorn or Tractor as the Ballidorse user, so other players can make the most use of your stasis weapon boost. Even better, you can swap to Solar and Rain of Fire to take advantage of Icarus Dash reloads, which can be done right after swapping from stasis. What is the best exotic setup for Broodweaver DPS? When it comes to Strand Warlock damage, you really have 2 good options, Ophidian Aspect and Necrotic Grip. Generally speaking, if you have multiple Broodweavers in a team, you should have 1 Necrotic while everyone else is on Ophids, since the melee tick damage from Necrotics doesn't stack. If you're the only Broodweaver, Thread of Ascent should provide enough of a handling boost that well-rolled weapons don't feel sluggish with dexterity mods on, so Necrotic is a good choice. And of course, though I don't think this needs to be said, Apotheosis Veil is a silly choice when Thread of Generation exists. Speaking of Thread of Generation, I often get asked whether or not Threadling Grenades are worth using over Grapple for Broodweaver damage. Given the Generation nerf and the reality of how tight Threadling Grenade uptime is with even high DPS rotations, I would stick to Grappling if you want to always have it when you need it. Finally, another Broodweaver question from this season. I've received many comments and DMs asking if Weavewalk's interaction with Rain of Fire is worth using to reload rockets, and the answer is no. The animation is too slow, nearly as slow as manually reloading rockets, and Broodweaver already has access to Thread of Ascent, making Weavewalk damage loss as it immobilizes the player during its downtime. When are Verity's Brow and Sunbracers worth using for damage? I get this question a lot, especially given how often Verity's Brow makes an appearance in speedruns, as well as how often Sunbracers does in Lowmans. People see that Verity's Brow is used in 3 of the 4 King's Fall boss encounters in speedrunning, or that Sunbracers can kill Ribbons solo, and they try to apply said damage strategies to regular LFG runs. Let me clear up some misconceptions. Verity's Brow and Touch of Flame fusion grenades are not actually very high DPS on their own. Some raids like Vow the Disciple and Vault of Glass have underlying factors like raid mods and damage multipliers, which can make grenades viable as a main source of damage rather than taking a filler role. However, in almost all scenarios, Verity's Brow is used in speedrunning because players are forced to play Solar Warlock to keep a well of radiance for movement purposes between encounters, or because they are limited on heavy ammo due to being on a sword or a combination of the two. Additionally, Verity's Brow is incredibly weak as a solo damage exotic since double damage grenades aren't particularly useful when you can only throw them once every 20 seconds. Given how the exotic works, you either need a competent teammate reciprocating field uptime with you, or you need a situation where your natural grenade regen is so high that it doesn't matter that you don't have field of flame yourself, like an Atheon. On top of this, even with Verity's teammates, most people actually end up losing DPS against standard damage options because they spend precious damage time focusing on getting and maintaining stacks of death throws when they could be just shooting their weapons at the boss. Sunbracers live in a similar niche. First of all, spamming Touch of Flame solar grenades is a relatively poor strategy against most bosses in this game. The only bosses where this strategy is even close to viable are unmoving with either hollow or massive hitboxes. There aren't many bosses in the game that meet these requirements, and of the ones that do exist, only a few of them are Sunbracers compatible. If you're just aiming to get your activities done and dusted, I'd say Sunbracers is really only a backup damage option for when you have nothing better to use, especially after this season's physics interaction change, where Touch of Flame solar grenade damage has been gutted against bosses like Riven. Is no backup plans worth using for shotgun damage? No. Sacrificing a damage super like Cura's Thunder Crash for a 35% damage boost that doesn't stack with Lumina, Radiant, Well, or other global buffs, and it requires full Void over Shield uptime, definitely not worth going for in any normal damage scenario, especially in full-size fire teams. How do I know which Gunslinger super to use? This is surprisingly not as easy of a choice as you might think. First, let's talk values. While these three numbers used to be a lot closer together last season thanks to the Kinetic Surge Golden Gun interaction, this season it's no contest. Feast of Light Blade Barrage hits for around 567k, Feast Golden Gun hits for around 461k, and Celestial Nighthawk hits for around 374k. So you should just always use Blade Barrage, right? Well, not exactly. While Blade Barrage is the best general hunter damage super, it's important to understand the specific context where all three of these supers are optimal. If you can pop your super early before damage without causing any problems, Nighthawk is the highest burst DPS super in the game by a mile, even if its total damage is quite poor. Last season, Kinetic Surge Feast Goldie actually did more total damage than Blade Barrage, and I was going to mention hit reg issues and damage inconsistencies as part of this section, but with the recent update with Season of the Witch, my conclusion has actually changed. In my testing this season, Blade Barrage is actually quite consistent and definitely hits for more damage on average than last season, probably owing to the partial physics changes that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, this leaves Star Scale's Golden Gun in the dirt, and I can't really see it being useful for anything outside of extremely niche scenarios involving consecutive super sustain. Is having a Stormcaller worth it for Arc Souls over Needlestorm? Usually the answer is no. Arc Souls do around 4600 DPS per player, scaling up to 10.3k DPS for the amped up version. And yes, these projectiles do stack perfectly, meaning that 6 Arc Souls blasting away does in fact do 6 times the health bar damage compared to 1. By comparison, Needlestorm does around 528k damage. Assuming a team contains 1 amplified plus 5 regular Arc Souls, that's around 33.3k DPS, which would take around 16 seconds to match a single Needlestorm's damage. However, there are two things to consider. First, Stormcaller doesn't have any good reload options like Threat of Ascent or Rain of Fire Icarus Dash, meaning the Arc Soul Warlock will be losing weapon DPS against a Broodweaver or Dawnblade. Second, Stormcaller doesn't have any good DPS supers. Geomag Chaos Reach is as close as it gets, and it's absolutely awful for DPS compared to any one-off super. Third, it's not as though a Stormcaller will be sitting doing nothing while a Broodweaver would be casting Needlestorm, so the DPS loss isn't as significant since not using Needlestorm means more time to shoot rockets. All in all, only in very rare circumstances will Arc Soul be worth using, and even then, it's certainly not a noticeable difference against Broodweaver at that. Does Well's Radiant work with Golden Gun? No. Make sure you're standing outside a Well of Radiance if you want your Golden Gun to benefit from regular Radiant, as the Well version of Radiant will override regular Radiant and provide no buff to Golden Gun. Why does Well of Radiance not work with certain mods and buffs? In previous years of Destiny, standing in a Well of Radiance converted all weapon damage into super damage. This is actually why standing in a well allowed weapons to pierce shield before the Radiant changes, since super damage bypasses non-champion shielding. While today this conversion exclusively applies to the well caster and not just anyone standing in the well, it still has some minor consequences worth knowing about. These include upsides and downsides. Anytime a boss might take more ability damage, like pre-patch Percy's Inspire of the Watcher, weapon damage from inside your own well will do more to said boss. On the other hand, anything that impacts weapon damage, including mods like Focus Light from Root of Nightmares and the Stasis weapon boost from Ballidorse Wrathweavers, will not work on players standing in their own well. As a fun fact, probably the most prominent example of this interaction's significance comes from the Last Wish raid. Experienced players would never use a well on Riven, since Lucent Blade, a Charge with Light mod at the time, provided a 35% damage boost to swords. If a well was placed, it would convert everyone's Lament damage to super damage, thus nullifying the effect of Lucent Blade and downgrading to a 25% buff, since super damage isn't sword damage. What is debuff extension and how does it work? Timer-based 30% debuffs like Tractor Cannon and Fellwinter's Helm can be refreshed by the application of a Void Weaken effect, like Echo of Undermining Grenades and Snare Bomb. This interaction does not work with either tether, since the debuff applied by those supers does not seem to apply as a timed status effect, but rather by a consistent connection to the tether object itself. This is quite useful in scenarios where you are trying to cram multiple roles like Debuff and Galahorn into a single player, like for example optimize solo Warlock damage on a boss or extremely fast fireteam boss kills. This season, Rapid Fire Ranger is a great way to refresh currently ticking debuff timers, as it is infinitely refreshable and only requires precision hits from a medium or longer distance. How does Banner of War work? Is it worth using? Banner of War stacks up to twice, counting your own banner plus a teammate's banner pulses. On swords, it provides a maximum of 10% extra damage and doesn't benefit from a teammate's pulses. On both Frenzied Blade and Bladefury, Banner of War boosted damage by 40% multiplicatively with a teammate's pulses, up to 1.96 times total. Grapple Melee was a little different, stacking with a 20% multiplicative bonus instead for a total of 1.44 times. Out of all of these options, Frenzied Blade is easily the most notable. Doing nearly 240,000 damage off one triple charge melee is comparable damage to shooting an entire mag of Horsemen with Lumina and triple Arc Surges active. For melee range bosses, this actually might make Berserker a legitimate damage subclass, given its access to Threat of Ascent for rocket reloads, even if this does require a 1-2 punch shotgun, biotic enhancements, and another nearby Banner of War. Is Pyrogale or Cuirass better for damage? In my testing, Pyrogale was extremely inconsistent in its damage from boss to boss on top of needing 3 setup kills. On the other hand, Cuirass Thundercrash works effectively on almost every boss where super damage is viable with 0 setup. On Templar, Pyrogale consistently did less than Cuirass even with a pre-patched Syntho swap. On Revan, it only did slightly more, which ends up being DPS loss due to its longer animation. And on Phrygia, Pyrogale went far above and beyond Cuirass in total damage, clocking in at 840k and 574k with and without Biotic, compared to Cuirass's 457k. So what's the deal? My conclusion is that now that the Syntheseps interaction has been patched, while Pyrogale is great in certain scenarios, it is still a very situational exotic that has decent total damage. In terms of DPS, its cast animation is pretty long due to being a roaming super, and that's not accounting for the damage loss you are likely incurring from moving to and from the setup location. On top of this, Pyrogale is clearly less compatible with team environments. Think about a raid where you might have 3 or more titans. All of them need roaring stacks, and then their Cyclone Scorch ticks likely aren't stacking either, which cuts into total damage. In most cases, Cuirass crashing a boss is still going to be the play for most titans in raid scenarios. Hopefully this video answers some common questions some of you might have when it comes to DPS abilities and exotic armor. The next video is going to be about perks like Bait and Switch and Kinetic Tremors, with some in-depth explanations on how exactly they work so that you can better understand how and why to make the best use of them. If you have any questions about what I've said here, any and all testing backing these claims can be found in my boss damage spreadsheet, linked below as usual. Otherwise, feel free to leave a comment here asking whatever other questions you might have about boss DPS.